Well, I feel that barbarism and civilization are both deeply enmeshed in 20th century Europe. Barbarism and civilization I see as opposite sides of the same coin rather than opposite ends of a spectrum. I use the term civilization in the sense in which Freud used it, namely as a form of repression of what he saw as the baser or most fundamental instincts in man, sexual instincts and violent instincts. And in the 20th century in Europe, it's clear that on a collective basis, these forms of civilizational repression broke down, and barbarism in many ways broke through. And that is as it were, the underlying argument of the book. Because the great mystery and the great paradox of the 20th century is the tremendous advances that one sees in the course of the past 100 years, in the extension of human life, in the advance of technology, in the tremendous growth of the economy, in the growth of virtually universal literacy in Europe, on the one hand, and at the same time, not as a sort of falling back from it, but intermeshed with that, the great collective violence that occurs particularly in the second quarter of the 20th century. And any historian of Europe in the 20th century must somehow come to grips with that fundamental paradox. In some ways, depending on how we define civilized, we are less repressed. We are less repressed sexually, for example, than we were in 1914. Homosexuals can live without fear today. People can live in what used to be called sin without undergoing social repression. Marriage, of course, is no longer the only way of forming a family unit. There are other ways, I think, in which the repressive shackles of our civilization have loosened in the course of the century. I mention many of them in the book. Our attitudes towards weaker elements in society, the disabled, the mentally ill, old people, children, criminals in prison, I mean, or criminals not sent to prison, or animals. All these attitudes have changed fundamentally and in general have become more, I call it, tender in Europe in the 21st century than they were at the beginning of the 20th. Again, reflecting shifts in values and a loosening of social restrictions, a change in the way we conceive, again, our civilization. In the early 20th century, God was still a living presence in the minds of most Europeans. Not all. There had been a slow process of secularization in Europe, dating back at least to the Enlightenment. But God still governed men's thoughts and to some extent men's moral acts in the early 20th century. God, institutionalized in the churches, also played a very important social and political role in Europe in the early 20th century. And that slowly changed in the course of the century. Today, the churches are no longer a major institutional force in most of Europe. It's not just a matter of the institutional decline of the church. It's not just a matter of decline in religious practice. there's a lot of evidence to show that Christianity is no longer the dominant force in the formation of moral codes for the greater part of the population of this continent. As one might convincingly argue, it still was for much of the population, probably the majority of the population of Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, in the course of the 20th century, other codes tried to replace it. One very prominent example is communism. Those collapsed, and we are left in the early 20th century with no one overriding moral influence of the kind that Christianity represented in the early 20th century. Instead, we are left with individualism, with the idea that the individual has the right to form his or her own moral outlook and own moral codes, which must to some degree mesh with those of society as a whole. One cannot, for example, successfully practice cannibalism or polygamy or pedophilia in Europe in the early 21st century. But within certain limits of those kinds, the individual is much freer to form his or her own moral outlook and moral code without reference to either the institution of the church or to a God inside his or her head. And that is a fundamental change which differentiates the 20th and 21st centuries from really all of the previous centuries, going back to the arrival of Christianity in this continent. And that is really very, very fundamental, it seems to me.